I've always been a sucker for ghost stories, which is why I leapt at the chance to join a team of paranormal investigators for a documentary on the old Hawthorne Asylum. Nestled in the outskirts of town, the asylum had been abandoned for decades, its decaying structure a grim reminder of its dark past. Rumors swirled about the place being haunted by the tortured souls of its former patients. Skeptical but curious, I never truly believed the tales, until the night we entered Hawthorne Asylum. Our team consisted of Jake, the lead investigator and camera guy, Sarah, the tech expert who set up all the recording devices, and Emily, the psychic medium who claimed she could communicate with spirits. Me? I was just the guy who tagged along for the thrill of it, a curious 28-year-old with a penchant for the macabre. We arrived at the asylum just as the sun was setting. Its looming, gothic structure was cloaked in shadows, the crumbling walls and broken windows giving it an air of menace. Jake went over our plan one last time. We'd spend the night exploring the asylum, documenting any paranormal activity we encountered. As we passed through the rusted gates, a chill ran down my spine. It was as if the building itself was watching us, waiting inside. The air was heavy with decay. Peeling paint hung from the walls like dead skin, and the smell of mold and rot was overwhelming. The faint echo of our footsteps bounced off the empty corridors, each creak and groan of the building amplifying the growing sense of dread. We started in the main lobby, where Sarah set up a base of operations with her monitors and recording devices. Jake and Emily ventured off to explore the first floor while I stayed behind with Sarah to help set up. It didn't take long for things to get weird. "Do you hear that?" Sarah whispered, her eyes wide as she stared at the monitor. I strained my ears but heard nothing. "Hear what?" "There it is again," she insisted. This time, I caught it, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like someone speaking just out of earshot. We exchanged uneasy glances, but before we could say anything, Jake's voice crackled over the walkie-talkie. "We're getting some serious activity down here. Emily's picking up on something strong. You guys might want to join us." Sarah and I grabbed our gear and hurried down the darkened hallway, our flashlights cutting through the oppressive gloom. The whispers seemed to follow us, growing louder with each step. By the time we reached Jake and Emily, my heart was pounding in my chest. Emily stood in the center of a large room, her eyes closed and hands outstretched. "There's so much pain here," she murmured, her voice trembling. "So much anger." Jake pointed the camera at her, his face pale. "We've been hearing voices. Doors slamming. This place is alive." As if on cue, a door at the far end of the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. We all jumped, and Sarah let out a yelp. "That wasn't the wind," she said, stating the obvious. We decided to split up again, this time taking different floors. Jake and Emily headed upstairs while Sarah and I explored the basement. The further down we went, the colder it became, and the air grew thick with an almost tangible sense of dread. The basement was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and small, windowless rooms. It was easy to get lost, and more than once, I had to backtrack to find my way. In one particularly dark corridor, we found an old operating room. Rusted surgical instruments lay scattered on a blood-stained table, and the walls were lined with shelves filled with dusty medical equipment. "This must have been where they conducted their experiments," Sarah said, her voice barely above a whisper. The history of Hawthorne Asylum was notorious. It was known for the cruel and inhumane experiments conducted on its patients, electroshock therapy, lobotomies, and other barbaric treatments that were little more than torture. Many of the patients had died here, their spirits supposedly trapped within these walls. As we were documenting the room, the temperature suddenly dropped. My breath came out in white puffs, and a deep sense of foreboding washed over me. "We need to get out of here," I said, but Sarah was already ahead of me. We regrouped in the lobby, where Jake and Emily were waiting. They looked shaken. "We saw something upstairs," Jake said. "A shadow figure. It followed us." Emily nodded, her face pale. "It's trying to communicate. They all are. They want us to know what happened here." Reluctantly, we decided to continue our investigation. We moved to the East Wing, where the most violent and disturbed patients had been housed. The atmosphere was even more oppressive here, the shadows deeper and the silence more profound. As we walked down the hallway, the whispers returned, louder this time. They seemed to be coming from all directions, echoing off the walls and filling the air with a cacophony of disembodied voices. Doors slammed shut behind us, and our flashlights flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. In one of the rooms, we found an old journal, its pages yellowed and brittle with age. It belonged to a doctor who had worked at the asylum, detailing the horrific treatments and experiments he had performed. The entries grew more and more deranged, the doctor's handwriting becoming increasingly erratic. He wrote of hearing voices, seeing shadowy figures, and being tormented by the spirits of his victims. "We need to leave," Emily said, her voice trembling. "They don't want us here." But leaving wasn't going to be easy. As we made our way back to the lobby, the building seemed to come alive around us. Doors slammed shut, trapping us in a maze of dark, narrow corridors. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, and shadowy figures appeared in the corners of our vision. Always just out of reach, panic set in as we realized we were trapped. Every path we took led us deeper into the asylum, the walls closing in around us. The spirits were no longer content to merely haunt us. They wanted to keep us here, to make us a part of their eternal torment. We finally made it back to the lobby, but our relief was short-lived. The front door, our only means of escape, was sealed shut. We pounded on it, shouted for help, but there was no one to hear us. We were alone, trapped in a building filled with the vengeful spirits of the past. Desperation took hold as we searched for another way out. The whispers were deafening now, the shadowy figures growing bolder, appearing right in front of us before vanishing into thin air. It felt like we were being hunted, herded deeper into the asylum by unseen forces. In a last-ditch effort, we decided to make our way to the roof, hoping to signal for help. The climb up the rickety staircase was a nightmare in itself, each step creaking ominously beneath our weight. As we neared the top, Emily let out a blood-curdling scream. I turned just in time to see her being dragged back down the stairs by an unseen force. We tried to grab her, to pull her to safety, but it was too late. She disappeared into the darkness, her screams echoing through the halls. We were 3 now, and the fear was palpable. We finally reached the roof, but there was no way down. The drop was too steep, and we had no ropes or equipment to safely climb down. We were trapped. As we huddled together, trying to come up with a plan, the whispers returned, louder and more menacing than ever. The spirits were closing in, their presence almost suffocating. The air grew colder, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Jake and Sarah were growing increasingly agitated, their fear turning into anger. "We need to find Emily," Jake said, his voice shaking. "We can't leave her behind." But we didn't have a choice. The spirits had made it clear. They wanted us all, and they weren't going to let us leave. Hours passed, each one feeling like an eternity. We took turns keeping watch, but the spirits were relentless. They tormented us with whispers, slamming doors, and shadowy figures that seemed to come closer with each passing moment. As dawn approached, our hope began to fade. We were exhausted, both physically and mentally. The spirits had worn us down, breaking our resolve. It felt like we were teetering on the edge of madness. In a final act of desperation, Jake decided to confront the spirits head-on. Armed with nothing but a flashlight and a camera, he descended back into the asylum, leaving Sarah and me behind. We listened to his progress through the walkie-talkie, his voice growing fainter as he ventured deeper into the building. And then, silence. We called out to him, but there was no response. Jake was gone, swallowed by the darkness that seemed to have a life of its own. Sarah was inconsolable, her tears mingling with the grime on her face. I held her, feeling utterly helpless. As the first rays of sunlight began to filter through the cracks in the roof, the whispers grew fainter, the shadowy figures retreating into the darkness. It was as if the spirits were retreating, waiting for nightfall to continue their torment. We made our way back down the stairs, careful to avoid the areas where we had encountered the most activity. The asylum was eerily quiet, the oppressive atmosphere lifting slightly with the arrival of daylight. We found Jake and Emily in the basement, their bodies lifeless and cold. The look of terror frozen on their faces was a grim reminder of the horrors they had endured. We couldn't bring ourselves to move them, to disturb the final resting place that the asylum had claimed for them. As we finally made our way out of the asylum, the front door creaked open with an almost mocking ease. We stumbled out into the fresh air, the sunlight a stark contrast to the darkness we had just escaped. We didn't look back, didn't speak. There was nothing left to say. The Hawthorne Asylum still stands, a decaying monument to the suffering of its former patients. the spirits that dwell within its walls remain, waiting for the next group of curious souls to enter, to join them in their eternal torment. And as for me, I no longer seek out ghost stories. I've lived one, and that's enough.